one of the things that's striking about the sort of hatred that you've gotten from so many is that you've literally been asked why you're even bothering to speak to men. I mean, there is this crisis of masculinity, right? There is this idea that every form of masculinity is toxic, and you've spent your life trying to talk to men and say, no, you can channel that masculinity in not only a good way, but a necessary and productive and useful way. And people have gotten angry at you for this. Where do you think that's coming from? Why? That's obviously a good thing that you're doing. Why are so many people upset with you for that?
Well, the thing is, I never really set out to talk to men specifically, but I did set out, at least in part, to make a case for the utility of both the feminine and the masculine spirit, and it turned out that making the case for the masculine spirit was something that was more demanded by the culture, let's say. The anger, that's a complicated issue. We touched on some of it in relationship to the despoiling of nature and the idea of the oppressive and atrocity committing patriarchy. But then there's another issue too, which I think is germane. Because of family fragmentation, there's a very large number of women who have, just like there's a very large number of men who have never had a real word of encouragement in their whole life. It's a really sad thing to see. It's a really, really sad thing to see that deeply and to have seen that reflected in so many thousands of people. But there are many women who've never had a positive relationship with anyone male in their life. And so one of the consequences of that, we know, for example, that younger women are more likely to be attracted to men who show dark triad traits, narcissistic, Machiavellian, and psychopathic. And people who have those traits are characterized by the mimicry of competence. And so what women want in men more than anything else is competent generosity, and the data on that are very clear. But you can mimic that if you're narcissistic, and if you're a young woman, you can be deluded by that. It's partly because it points to the problem of dissociating competent confidence from the expression of power per se. So we could call power, I'll define that as the willingness and ability to use compulsion to attain your aims. Now, if you are someone who has a proclivity to manifest power, then that looks like the manifestation of both ambition and will. And if you haven't had a positive relationship with anyone masculine in your life, and maybe not even with your own internal masculinity, say, you can't discriminate between power and the ambition that serves competence. And so because that's terrifying, because the power, if you have had only negative relationships with men, their capability to use power becomes such a threat that it has to be opposed at all costs, even if it manifests itself within the developmental pathway of your own son. And so some of that's familial breakdown, and then you have a multi-generational pattern of that makes it even worse. And so that's definitely part of it. You know, there's an ideological drum that's being beaten constantly, both on the sociological constructivist front, right? That's the oppressive patriarchy, and then on the environmental front. And then you add to that the fact that, well, on the leftists, especially the radical types, their whole damn doctrine, it's the most pathological doctrine you could invent if you set out to invent a pathological doctrine. And I mean that. I'm not making a joke. I really mean that in the deepest possible sense. The notion that the fundamental human motivation is the willingness and ability to use compulsion, power. It's all about power. And every time I hear that now from someone, I think, that is not a sociological observation. That is a confession on your part. And it's also just complete bloody nonsense. I mean, you all know this. You have friends because they're compelled to be your friends? Like, that's definitely not how you have friends. You might have bully henchmen that way, but you don't have friends. Power is an extraordinarily unstable basis to establish a marriage on. Plus, it just doesn't work, because it turns out that women who are so annoying are very difficult to oppress, you know. So you can try, but it's not that easy. And I don't think that we've been all that historically successful in doing so. But it's also a preposterous proposition, because the expression of power within an intimate relationship does not produce intimacy or a relationship. The best it can produce is like a combination of tyranny and slavery, and that does not characterize the institution of marriage per se. So there is this insistence among the radicals that power is the fundamental motivation, and then you think too, okay, you're only motivated by power. That means that we can only get along if our interests align, because if you're motivated by power and I'm motivated by power and our interests don't align, and there's nothing else but power, then the only option I have is to turn you into an enemy and try to destroy you, because we can't engage in dialogue. That's dialogos. And the reason we can't engage in dialogue is because there's no logos. There's just power. So there's no such... This is why it's a good thing for conservatives to understand. You have to understand that the debate about free speech on campus, in the deepest sense, is not a debate about who should be allowed to speak freely. That's nothing. That's a trivial debate. You can even understand it in some sense. If I don't agree with you, maybe I don't want you to talk. But the debate is about something much deeper, which is whether or not the idea of free speech itself is just a mask developed essentially by Europeans to justify the oppressive patriarchy in the most devious possible way. And the answer the radicals have to that question is yes, that's exactly what it is.